Thank you, all three of you. In the interest of getting more people in the room to talk, I'm going to open it to the floor first, and then if we exhaust questions, Andrew, which I don't think we will, I will pose some to our panelists. But feel free to open up and ask them to follow up, to expand upon, or anything that's on your mind. All right.
Anything across the spectrum of biosemiotics, panpsychism, religious naturalism? I see Matt, always faithful to ask a question.
Don't mind if I do, if no one else is jumping at the chance. My question's for Benjamin about biosemiotics. Let's say that the process philosopher takes up this invitation, replaces their panpsychism or panexperientialism with a biosemiotic approach. Do we then have to worry about vacuous actualities? When you say there's no mentality in the in the physical world, does that mean there's no experience, there's no feeling? Do you mean mind in a more conceptual sense? So, and when I say vacuous actuality, you know what I mean? Whitehead's worry about that. So if we take biosemiotics, what happens to that concern?
Yeah, if you're on point, and if you are, I'm presenting you with the pill choice in the Matrix, and I'm saying, take the pill and go all the way down like Neo did, and you're gonna have to accept that particles are just matter in motion that physicists can mathematically predict. But at the level of life, you still get a lot of what you want. And my gift of it's a bitter pill to swallow, but this is what you get, is just the heightened importance of living creatures, which is not just human beings, responding when that level does emerge. So if I could layer them, it's Deacon's emergence kind of presumes a baseline of physical reality that is vacuous, it's just matter in motion. But then we have aggregate properties, then we have forms and structures and not just properties, and then we have life passing information. Biosemiotics is a newer field that's a wrinkle on top of that, where when Deacon says third order life, it's really interpretation, which happens in physical entities, but they would call it like degraded interpretation because there's not like a mental active interpretation or a third party interpreting. So a flag flapping in the wind is a sign of the wind, but the flagpole is not interpreting it as that. But in living beings, like the algae I talked about, there's a three-part process that can't just be described in cause and effect, so it's not just billiard balls hitting each other, because the stem interpreted the missing DNA to form the algae all over again because the DNA was missing. So you have interpretation at the level of life, and then that gets more complicated. You get mental phenomena, and then that gets way more complex, and you have great apes, other intelligent animals, and human intelligence eventually. So yes, you'll have to take the pill, but it gets better.
Hi, thank you. This is a question for Dr. O. Thank you for your presentation. I am processing all of this concept of Hanul for the very first time, listening to you today. So this is a very beginner question. I'm intrigued by the triadic structure that you presented. With humans, I think I heard you say as a medium between heaven and earth. And it made me wonder, is there a concept of like what structure would have been conceived of or around the nature of reality and of God's activity in the world before humans or after humans?
Humans, thank you for your question, but humans are not just human. Humans symbolically myriad things. as plurisingularity and fluidity. But humans in that kind of samkai structure, like samtaega, the great triune ultimate, the yellow, symbolically human, but I interpreted human as living person in old days structure as myriad things. So before human, after human, maybe AI or post-humanism, or before human, but dinosaurs, any living things, it doesn't matter, because am I really a human right now? I'm not so sure. So we cannot really definable, human cannot be definable. But if you ask the question from the lineage of like human appearance in this world, that is not the human I talked about. But the medium idea is cool.
Other comments or questions on these themes?
Yeah, there's been recent research, and I don't know all of it and a lot of the details, but what I know of it is that there was one experiment with green sulfur bacteria where electrons were excited in various states and had to, and then sample different routes of photosynthesis, and then sort of went back in time and chose the best route to take. So there seems to be evidence of choice making even at the level of electrons. And I'm just curious as to how that maybe changes or informs, well, maybe Ben, but if others want to jump in, how that might inform your own thinking about the possibility of pan-experientialism.
There was the article, Decision-Making Bacteria, I think was the title, which is maybe what you're referencing.
Can I use it to ask Ben a question? Because I want to see if I heard you well. So when you were
Did
talking,
one of you want to respond to Sherry's question?
yeah,
or maybe, okay.
no, it was raising that, right?
Okay.
So let's just assume that's a completely repeatable experiment, and now you have to make the case and want to know how you differentiate between a kind of process pan-experientialist position and and Ben and I've argued about this for 12 years now, and that was like the most compelling version. 15? Oh, Jesus Christ, loves us. But this time, I think one of the things that hit me is that you raised the emergence of unconscious interpretation in nature. And there you have a metaphysically more viable, in your opinion, to the empirical data of what process people use when they talk about concrescence. And then later you talked about all the way down to something like what Sherry's referring to of a biological entity making judgments of valuation to their environment, which is kind of the narrow slice of what process people tend to do with prehension. Is that, would you say that's similar?
Yes. So the thing about biosemiotics is the unconscious interpretation bit has to be triadic, and that's why they use Peirce's philosophy. So for Peirce, semiosis, it's always 3 parts. So I don't just look at see green, so we've got the banners hanging. I don't just look and see green. I'm actively comparing the colors to see the shades of green. They're not just snapshots, so the British empiricists were wrong. Biosemioticians refer to it as unconscious because no central nervous system, but there is it's a triadic process. So the marker is triads are a marker of life. So it helps distinguish. So like, when can we say there's life? Saying there's life is not very specific. Actually saying there's experience is not very specific. Obviously in Whitehead's philosophy you can get really specific about experience, but saying life, triads go together is a very helpful marker in their work.
In the middle voice, the grammatically middle voice, it exists in plant's life, and the middle voice is indefinable. So the human as medium somehow need to be quiet, just like plants. those kind of consciousness level is somehow like we are over-interpreting more than humankind. So somehow like we need to broadly understand the consciousness, because I know I was inspired by this morning's conversation about left to right and brain, but process metaphysics try to go beyond the dualistic metaphysical structure. However, somehow it came down to be the embodiment of consciousness level, but we have to go down more, down to the earth, more and more, rather than just here. That's what I'm thinking. But the triadic structure, somehow it's open structure, and if we spin the triangle, then we can see the spiral of all these three symbolic directions, like Tian, heaven, earth, and myriad things.
Other comments, questions? Go to Hart.
Thanks. Assume that an interpretation of quantum mechanics like Bohm's would be true. We don't know yet which one is true, but that's a coherent interpretation. And so then the individual electron or photon would read off the quantum potential, basically the information about all its environment. So it, in that sense, it has a mental representation and reads signs and so on. So if an interpretation, it's semiotic in that minimalistic sense. It's not conscious yet. And some have tried to connect that to panpsychism, but it's certainly not panpsychism in the sense that everything's conscious, but everything, even deep down, has the possibility of mental representation. So would something like this then be incompatible with your view?
Would it be incompatible?
Incompatible, yes. So if I say that, let's assume for a moment we are Bohmians, yeah? Just assume it. Yeah.
So there is a debate within my understanding of the biosemiotic literature, and it's partially Peirce scholars being drawn to the biosemiotic literature after the fact. Peirce scholars, kind of via Peirce, tend to want to say triads are in all of nature, and biosemioticians tend to want to say triads only at the level of life, not in physical entities. Peirce thought there were triads everywhere, and in a way that actually went along with your paper that goes to tens of thousands and things in millions, because the signs all implicate one another. So once you get to 3, an infinite number of signs could be involved. I tend to want to stick with the biosemiotics folk and say triads at the level of life, and say physical forms of triad relationships are kind of, oh gosh, I'm blanking on Peirce's term, but like they're a degraded form of triads or semiosis. It's not that they're not that, but they don't fully perform the act of interpretation the way that it happens at the level of life. So I don't think it's necessarily incompatible. It's an ongoing debate. If I had to take a stance right now, I would make the dividing line higher up with the levels of emergence, but I don't think that that's necessarily a fully decided issue amongst the kind of the story that I told.
I'm not really sure answering your question. However, somehow like when we make a dialogue between philosophy and science, in religion and science, or theological scientific kind of ecological movement, we need to think and consider the Eastern scientific kind of observation of nature, like aging, like book of change, rather than the Western kind of mathematical kind of science. That's what I'm thinking.
And while Andrew's walking over, I thought of the term, degenerate. They would be degenerate signs of semiosis, or like degenerate thirdness. So it's not like triadic interpretation isn't happening. It's just that the third party isn't as in control of really determining the digital analog like interplay as it is at the level of life. So that's the term I was looking for.
And the thirdness is in-betweenness. So thirdness actually, in Korean, the pronunciation etymologically sam, that means living. So sam is sam, but spelling differently, sam and sam. So like han and han. So sam, saram, salim, salim, sarang, love, they're all from thirdness actually. And Chinese Hanja as renjin, ningan, means two people in between. That means human beings. So human beings are in-betweenness. So in between, if we want to recognize our spatial temporality, our existential conditionality, understand better, then we are not static thirdness, we are betweenizing. In that sense, we are all betweenizing, not just humans. So there is kind of transformation, transfiguration, transmigration happen to be when we are living. I don't care about before and after living, but when we are living, that's the thirdness.
So I'd like to suggest a way of cutting things. I think you can do triadic analysis all the way down. No problems there. The cut with between non-living and living things, I think we should suggest that's where consciousness begins, where purpose begins, because the purpose of trying to survive gives an individual something different than just being determined in some kind of causal way. And so that's where I would suggest you might look for the break, not at triadic, but at purpose and consciousness. So, response.
I don't know the non-living and living difference within my consciousness or thinking. However, even triadic structure is symbolic and as metaphor of multiplicities, not like static reality as triad. And that's because one day I was in Korean sauna, King sauna in New Jersey, which is good, recommend. But there was a kind of emerald room, and I lay down with my husband and look at that. There is all like a star-like, a Jewish star-like symbol was there, and we started to count triangle, and we actually stopped counting it after like 20-something. It's numerous. It looks like one, but the numerous triangles. So I don't want to actually consist on three or threeness, but everything is somehow metaphorically working. And at that moment, I feel like that's useful more than two, useful than two. That's why. But it can be more.
Great.
I think I would push back briefly, but I would say if I could get all the process thinkers in the room to agree triads all the way down, but only psyche at Deacon's third order, I'd call it a win and go home. So.
Mine is for Tripp. So Tripp, this goes a little bit beyond your paper, but I was thinking about revelation and panexperientialism, and I was wondering, does revelation mean anything to the non-human world, and if so, what?
Yes, but I mean, so part of the, using the notion revelation theologically in a part is the way in which possibilities are contextualized for the flourishing of the web of life. And thinking theologically about the way the previous event is both brought into the divine life via the consequent nature, so the primordial gift of possibility is contextualized to the flourishing response of the creature in context to all of its creaturely relations, right? And so the analogy that of looking at revelation is the way in which those potentials for relational development like flourished over time and developed in the larger cosmic story. And I think that is one revelatory of the notion of God that process relational people argue for, present in all sorts of ways. Like in some sense, God has been giving God's self in whatever way it could be received moment to moment, from quantum fluctuation in a vacuum until we make eye contact, make love, sing a symphony, forgive someone that's harmed you. And so that whole cosmic story is there, inherited in the past, and meeting the invitation to say yes to the gift of life before you. And so like in that way, it's there, and it's revelatory, right, of the divine nature. And I think that's why Whitehead, at the end of Process and Reality, and looking at the different notions of God, the moralist, the lawgiver, being, and such, because, but there's a fourth option, the Galilean vision. Patient operation, tenderness, that the nature of God has been showing up moment to moment, and it's precisely by giving the gift of divine life that then generates the depth of possible responsiveness. And as the theological line was that in Jesus' fidelity, in a sense, to that great inheritance of his religious tradition, he gives existence to the divine insistence that came moment to moment. His fidelity, right, is inheriting that whole cosmic relationship. But then he images the invisible God, or as the fruits of the vine of David.
Oh, no pressure there. So Tripp, this builds on Bethany's question, I think, partly because I want to know the end of the story and if you successfully converted them, and mainly because it strikes me that the traditioning conversation that you were having is a lot easier to have with the Thomist and within Catholic teaching than a strict Bardian adherence, not just to Revelation, but to like an interventionist, exceptionalist version of Revelation. So, what kind of is the outcome there, particularly with the Bardian, because that seems to be a...
Okay, so in that, at the bar conversation, it led to this moment where he uses the phrase, conditions for the possibility of revelation, which in one sense you feel good about your student loans because you kind of know where it's going. But also you kind of know where it's going. And he used the story of Jesus picking up the soldier's ear after Peter cut the ear off in the garden, right? And he puts it back on, and he says, Tripp, God has to create the conditions for the possibility for you to hear and receive faith. Right? And that particular thing I find ultimately problematic. And in the story is interesting because like he naturally had an ear and had to get it put back on because of the violence of the proto-patriarch in the story. But the interesting thing in our conversation was the contact point where the change happened, like asking what happened, was I sent him Pannenberg's letter complaining to Karl Barth about this, where Pannenberg says, basically, I have no idea. You have beautiful doxological language, Karl, but I have no idea if it relates to the world we actually live in. And if you ask anyone that in the world we live in, the medium for anything, using the word revelation, occurs through bodies, it happens in history, and religion is part of it. And so that kind of protecting the event of revelation from our relational, material, historical reality ultimately deflates its power, even though you get to perform the linguistic symbols of the tradition with eternal justification from God's decision prior to creation and such. So the contact point in that conversation was helpful, was the way Pannenberg in that Bardian tradition reintroduced God's, in a sense, decision to embed the divine encounter through the medium of bodies, history, tradition.
Tripp, I'll let you have the last word, and will you join me, please, in thanking each of our panelists, Dr. Fuller, Dr. O, and Dr. Chicka. Thank you.